Andrews. I am a Hierophant of the Church of Witchcraft. Basically, I just keep things on the rails so they don't get too far off the beaten path. A lot of people are helping out with this, and you'll see them in and around Embers, obviously here, Gwen, Marisha, and a bunch of other people who may not be able to be here tonight, but there's a handful of us that are helping run this thing, so thanks to all of those guys as well. The witchcraft that I practice specifically is more along the lines of celestials, so think astrological kind of stuff, working with planetary correspondences and that sort of thing. And if you want more information on that, feel free to email us. Also, thanks to everybody who's here again, as well as anybody who's watching this on whatever platform, because they're so diversified, there's no way to name them all. But thanks for wherever you're watching this from, if you're watching this in the future. Tonight, we're going to be talking about binding and severing. So there's a secondary component to this as well. Binding is specifically inclusive of tethering or connecting. When we're binding things together, it's not just limiting something. It is also in terms of connecting two things together, or it's delineating a space where one thing is isolated. In any instance that you're doing any sort of binding, whatever it is, with whatever object, with whatever mediums, it's bidirectional. And I've said this ad nauseum recently, is that everything is really bidirectional. Anything that we're doing as witches generally will have some sort of influence both ways, right? If I'm doing something, I'm not just in isolation. It's why we see when we use sacred circles and that sort of thing, when we're casting our circles for any sort of ritual work, that's part of it, right? It's about making sure that we have that space available, protection, that sort of stuff, and a space that's a liminal state that we're working within. But even so, there's some feedback that's happening from the witch or witches, depending if you're working with a coven or a group, and then whatever is coming in, whether it's entities or magic or something along those lines, there's some sort of feedback that's happening within that. Whenever you're engaging in binding, whether it's tethering or connecting things, you're involved in it. The witch themselves is a conduit for that binding work that they're doing. I see this very frequently, like within my own tarot reading. Whenever I'm doing that for other people, I'm acting as a conduit, right? For people who aren't familiar with it, or people who are asking for that type of divination, I am acting as a medium between the liminal states, the beyond the magic, and themselves, and establishing that bridge with them in mind, right? So effectively, I'm a conduit in that context. Just like you would be a conduit, even if there's nobody else involved. If you're working at your altar and you're working with magic, for example, or you're doing any sort of the transmutation stuff that we talked about last time, that is something that is acting as a conduit. You have some stake in this. When we talk about severing, just very broadly as the last one, it's inclusive of parting or releasing. So severing is taking those things and putting them in different categories, right? In the vein of parting, it is also the idea of moving from one state to another, or putting things into different categories, or taking one aspect and removing it from another one. It may be in terms of using it for focus. The question would be in the severing, and this is sort of rhetorical for you, is this a dormant act, the severing, or is it inert, right? So is there something that is either an active severing, or is there a dormancy to this? So are you being passive within that? I guess passive and active might be a little easier in terms of describing this. Passively severing something would be akin to waiting, right? Waiting for something to decay, waiting for something to break down, right? Actually, I can bring that. So this, I don't know if you guys probably can't see this. There is actually what remains of a bird in here. There's a long story why I have this. But the point being is that in terms of it severing from this place, the materials that constitute its body, right, is a waiting game. I'm not actively doing anything to it. It is just passively decaying, right? Insofar as much as it can do inside of a jar. If it was something destructive or something that was more active, for example, it would be something like fire or something that would break down the parts and hasten that along, an active or passive kind of severing. As with all facets of our witchcraft, binding and severing shares ideologies akin to polarity. And we're talking of these two aspects, and they are seemingly opposite. But in terms of polarity, and this is just hallmarks of my type of witchcraft, the way that I understand magic, everything is generally connected. I think most of us can agree on that. In terms of polarity, you have two sides of a scale, and you're sliding between those, right? If we're talking binding and severing, if you're severing, you're doing less binding. If you're binding, you're doing less severing, right? So you're seeing two scales here. They're not all one or all the other. There's some component of both of these. And there's a movement between those. And this is that polarity. You'll see this everywhere. I prefer to think in terms of polarity versus duality because of that connection, the connection that we all have, just like I was talking about with the conduit component that all witches are part of when they're doing any of their witchcraft. There's some component that they have in that. And that polarity is that they're involved in where that movement is happening. And we're really instructing or guiding wherever that polarity is going to be going. In what ways, though, does severing bind? And in what ways does binding sever? And I'll kind of give you guys a couple of seconds to think about that if you have any answers for that. I will give my own 2 cents here in a second on that. In terms of these things being, when is severing binding? It is establishing a point in time. There's a temporality that happens within this. If I'm severing something, I'm breaking something, or I'm parting things at a certain point in time. And it binds or fixes it at a certain temporal location. At some level, severing has some binding principles to it that ties that action to that binding. Similarly, whenever I'm binding something, I'm isolating it from other things that it may be, right? So in some ways, these two share that kind of polarity. And that's what I'm getting at with that polarity, is that there are aspects of severing and binding in both of these, whatever action you're doing. Alluding to what I had said earlier, just about what the format that we're dealing with tonight, we're going to be talking slightly shorter. We're going to be doing an activity later, actually. And so there's a couple of options with this. So there is a writing component to that if you want to. There's a crafting component if you should so wish. And I'll go further into that as we get closer to that activity. But that'll give us some time for discussion as well as some active work with these aspects too. To expand on binding, it is to tether. There are 3 major categories that I want to highlight. There's a lot of different ways to do this. These are just going to give us some good, solid basis on what we're talking about when I talk about binding, and to give you some examples and some of the how on that. To bind something can mean to tether to one object or a place. So if I'm tethering something to an object or a place, I'm going to reference the time if you're doing anything like a cleansing. There was a specific instance for me where there was an entity that had manifested in a specific house. They'd asked me to do something about this situation. And so I used binding to take that entity and then attach it to a wooden block. There's a lot of different mediums that you can use, but this is just the approach that I took in this instance. But I tethered that entity into a inert object, right? So I'm tethering to an object. So I'm binding these two things together, right? Just like that concept of severing, I am removing that entity into another medium and taking it out of that location, right? It is separating at some point, even though it was active binding. A second variation is a connection. So taking two disparate things, and then just sticking them together. Think of it as I guess, magical hot glue two objects together, right? When you're connecting two things together, you can think of this in terms of poppets, right? I'm either redirecting energy into this, I'm connecting something to this, and this echoes some of the sympathetic and contagion magic. I forever get these two convoluted and mixed up because they are so similar. But sympathetic is a like object affecting an external object. So in the terms of a poppet, if you want to use the colloquial term of voodoo doll, that might help. It's a representation, and I have a certain target, external. Target is not to mean that it's just an objective term, but I'm going to do something to that the doll itself to cause an effect elsewhere. Sympathetic, like affects the external, right? If I want to destroy something or an idea of something, I might take a picture of that thing and then put it in a fire as an example. Sympathetic. Contagion has to do with contact. Contact being things that you might see classically. We'll stick with the poppets in that of themselves. With poppets, that contagion can be, you'll hear like hair, for example, is one that's very common. Don't leave your hair around, right? You can tie this onto the doll. It's something that's been in contact with the target that you have, and then that's increasing the potency of that object, right? This is a component of that binding aspect. I'm binding one person's energy likeness to a specific object, right? In terms of some sort of output. Whether or not you do it as a spell or a ritual or any other thing is kind of immaterial in this context. But that sympathetic contagion magic shows up in a lot of different places. You can go way more into depth with this when you start talking about thaumaturgic versus theurgic magic. I think I have a sermon on that. I should, because I remember making a graph about this like a year ago. So it's somewhere available to everybody if you would like more details on that specific thing. When I'm connecting something together, like using hair, for example, for a poppet, the energy of that individual, that's the signature. It's almost like I'm not sure if this would be the best way to phrase this, but tag lock almost. It is the identity of that individual, and it's making sure that it's focused on that specific thing instead of just being errant, just in the atmosphere, right? I'm giving something that is very akin to that, and the effect that I have on that, or the intention of that effect with that connective contagion hair that I'm using in that instance, is what's influencing the individual. Take it with a grain of salt on this one. Some people prefer more sympathetic stuff. Some people do contagion. Some are a mixture of these two things, but you might start seeing this in your own craft where you might be touching on sympathetic or contagion magic. And a third kind of binding is a combination of those things. So if you have a ghost, spirit, or entity, and then maybe a location, a place, or an object, it is the contagion, right? Let's just say, for sake of discussion, that the ghost is a deceased individual that has had something occur to them or has caused them to stay in that place. There's a contact, the contagion component to that. There's an object that they're now connected to, and that could be either a simple object. Gwen runs across these on occasion. Connections to objects, hairbrushes, for example, can sometimes give off these kinds of energetic signatures of individuals that have owned them before. You would think that it's strange that you would ever find these hairbrushes. They usually show up as antiques in antique stores, and they show up often in thrift stores where they're, getting rid of mid-70s hairbrushes in these places. And so there's a remnant of those individuals. Just like that would be with a ghost of some kind living in a location or where the tragedy might have occurred, there is that contact that they have to that location, and that binding also unites two things together. It can also, in terms of severing on the opposite side of that coin, if there's something already taking place within that location, if there's already a connection, if there's already a ghost that's attached to that location, it also may isolate that from other influences occurring. It can also be the opposite, where a lot more is attracted to it, and it's just it's a nexus of a bunch of, or a confluence for a lot of different entities or spirits to congregate in that specific location. So it can kind of go both ways. Usually if it's a singular ghost or entity of some kind, the incident is probably going to be heightened and escalated, probably fairly traumatic, and will probably have a lot of activity and it'll be more directed towards individuals in the location or objects or items in that location versus it being a confluence with a whole bunch of things. You may just think about the Stanley Hotel, right? There's a lot of people, there's a lot of things that have gone on there. It's more of a confluence than anything else. There's nothing really intense that I've ever described, I've ever detected there myself, but it's errant things, footsteps, walking, coughing, maybe some murmurs. These are all sort of minimal interactions, right? They're not hugely traumatic. But rules change depending on what you're dealing with, right? These are all with a grain of salt, right? In binding, you can take this to mean that there is an object or plane that you're tethering yourself to, just like you do within a circle for your own protection or for your rituals or to create that liminal space. You have a connectivity to sympathetic or contagion magic, and maybe a combination of those as well. The next up is severing. Severing is, again, we're going to go with the same triptych that we have. Entwined wicks, so taking two candles and tying their wicks together, or tying two candles together with a string in the middle of them, something along those lines. Often these are errantly attributed to cord cutting rituals. I will get into that in a minute, but the Ember actually wrote a blog about that specifically and talked about some of the differences within how cord cutting rituals work and different variations on those. Tying wicks together, from what I understand, I would consider that more of a spell of severance. So I would be interested in making that intention manifest within those two objects and the string that's between them. So if I have one candle, another candle, I tie them together with twine, I'm looking to enact a spell, right? It's not necessarily a historic version of cord cutting specifically. Cutting has another aspect to it. You can also use that same kind of tying two candles together as a divination method, right? So how are things going to break apart? How volatile might it be? So there's other aspects that you can gain from this kind of candle magic that exists, but it's a form of that severing because it's putting that idea in your mind of what things are going to be breaking apart or analyzing something that's breaking apart. And so it's assisting some of that severing. This may be used in conjunction with something else, right? So I might do a spell severance along with something like a binding, or I might start a spell of severance and then move to a more historic cord cutting. I don't really want to stay away from tradition because tradition varies so broadly. Into cord cutting, often this is seen across history and regions that they're used with shears, like magical shears, big scissors, or an athame, right? It doesn't even necessarily have to be a physical state either, right? We will see athames used commonly to open a circle if it's cast so that you can move between the realms from the mundane to the spiritual. That's another place that you'll see this. It's not directly a cord cutting, but that is a form of that kind of severance, of cutting two things in twain. When you're using the shears, it would be using something like a rope, right? That you would have some sort of intention that you can do some rituals or spells around to set those up. And for that specific thing, that I want to sever these two components of my life, right? Or these two aspects. It doesn't necessarily even need to be people. Cord cutting can be from old ideas, bad habits, things you don't want in your life, and you're taking those and severing those from your life. And so using those shears, Wrath may also, like Ember's blog had mentioned, doesn't run the risk of burning down your house. Be careful with candles and fire. You guys don't really understand how much fire is in this room right now. There's actually 2 candelabras on the side of this, and there are 14 candles that are lit in this room that are right next to me usually. Also, you can see there's a whole bunch of candles over here. There's even more candles down here. There's a lot of flame here, okay? So us doing any sort of cord cutting rituals and stuff, if we're using candles, we have to be kind of careful because, I mean, this isn't a tall ceiling. So be careful when you're using fire for any kind of severing or any purpose. A mixture of these two things, staying with that sort of principle that we saw from binding, that you can bind to sever. So this can be seen when you're doing something along the lines of like a blindfold. You're limiting one sense, your sight, for example, and that's to separate you from a physical plane, right? if I'm removing something like that that's really important to me or sense that I use very frequently, I am severing one kind of sense to heighten other senses. So I can use a binding to sever. I can bind myself to make it easier to separate off, right? It's breaking down to smaller components to then move that or part that from another way, right? You can also see, and I've mentioned this recently too, so it's been on my mind so much, but solve coagula, break down and then recombine. You're severing, breaking down, and then you're binding them together, right? I can sever things and then reconstitute them into something else, just like we do within our first altar. Just as I was saying in the transmutation aspect from last sermon too, that you're able to take these components, break them down, and that's that form of severing, breaking off from the whole, and then I may bind them to something else, or they may just be dissipated into another form. You can get really deep into the alchemy on that on your own time. Severing and binding have that polarity because of these reasons that you're hearing, these kinds of examples that you're hearing. How do these two interact? They oppose or support each other, right? How does binding and severing support or oppose each other? It's in those terms of that breaking down in constituent components and then reconstituting them. It's taking apart some part of you that might be a barrier to doing your witchcraft. It is akin to doing shadow work, to sever components of yourself or to break those away and then rebind yourself, right? Binding is not necessarily a negative thing, right? If we're doing any sort of combinations or connections or attachments, they can be really assistive. It is something to be aware of if you are binding anything, to know what parts are going to go into it. You don't want these sort of errant things coming into whatever you're trying to bind together. You want a very focused, manifested way to do this so that there's a consistency and surety that that binding takes more. It is more efficacious. So if you take in mind, like, let's use the concept of glue. If I'm putting two things together with glue and then I start moving it around, it's just going to separate. I need to make sure that the surface is clean. I need to do preparation work for that to stick the two things together more effectively, wait for the bond to occur. Binding is no different, right? Severing may take time too. It may be things that you're stronger attached to. They're both necessary for different reasons at different aspects, and they can be used in a lot of different ways in the examples I've given. And there are certainly ones that you may also be thinking of too. And with that, shockingly, I managed to time this well. I should stop being surprised by this point. Like, I keep getting surprised by the fact that I keep hitting my time marks. Let's see if I can share my screen. Miss Eye in the Sky Gwen, can you please give me the ability to share?
Sure. How do I do that?
You will have to do that somewhere at the bottom of your Zoom. Spoiler alert, we're using Zoom today. While she figures that out, again, our activity is going to have a couple of different components to this. You don't have to do them all. You don't have to do any of them. And you'll see that come up pretty soon here whenever I get the sharing option.
I think you should have the ability to share now.
Oh, let's give it a shot. Oh, look at that. That's fantastic. All right, so I'm going to disappear here for a second. Can everybody see that? I'm just going to assume that you can.
Yes.
Okay. So with this, there are three options on here. Your reflection prompt is for binding and severing on this one. So the first two you can write down as your own prompts and the third one is to prepare materials for binding or severing. I don't know if all of you have those in immediate vicinity to you. So these are just options that you can take. To prepare materials would be finding the materials that you want to use, whether that's for a binding or severing operation in the future. You can pick one or all of these if you would like to do them. We won't be doing the binding or severing here, but you may be using things like rope or twine or those kinds of things. And then secondarily, you could also take those prompts. So I'm going to give you a little bit of time here, and I'll come back on in a few minutes, and then we'll have a little bit of a discussion about these questions. All right, now that we've had a chance to work on that, we're going to practice our Zoom skills and see if we can raise those hands.
Monty, you may ask your question.
Okay, so my question is about this idea of polarity between binding and severing. Would you say it's more akin to like the polarity of two sides of a coin, so that one is always present with the other, or because those are kind of like, that's what I was gathering from the examples, or is it more of like a scale, like an acid or pH scale, where there's like more or less binding or severing?
I think it might be in terms of both. I know that's kind of a cop out to say, so I'll be a little more specific. I think there are always going to be components of binding with severing and vice versa. To your point of it being more acidic or more neutral, I guess would be the word I'm looking for. What's the opposite?
Basic.
Basic.
Alkaline.
Thank you. Apparently, oh my gosh, too much chemistry for a witch. I'm just saying, at least for this one. But some of that is there may be. I think I lean more towards there's going to be components of both now that I'm thinking about it, because there's not really like when I'm binding, there's not like an intensity increase, right? In terms of like, oh, if I'm binding, there's going to be more severing. Like it doesn't correlate that way in my brain, at least. It seems like there's just going to be aspects of that between the two when they're happening, depending on the intention of it. How do you see it, Monty?
I was gathering it more of the way that you described it there at the end. I think the thing that initially confused me was talking about like it possibly being a scale, but I think it makes more sense, especially through the examples and thinking about it, of there just being aspects of them in each other. So thank you.
So I guess instead of like a polarity thing, would it be kind of more of like a yin yang example of like there's some aspects in each one, but it's not like as one grows, the other one weakens or something?
Yes, I think that would be an apt explanation of that. I don't think that. I think the thing that's going to change the intensity is related to what your intention is, right? If I'm intentionally binding something, the severing is not going to be necessarily my focus. And so it's not the thing that's occurring. There's still an aspect of that that may be happening just by virtue of separating, just like with an entity into an object from a location. I am removing it from that, but my intention is to bind. It's not the intention to sever. Does anybody else have maybe experiences that they want to share about their witchcraft with binding and severing? You can keep it fairly scrubbed of information if they're particularly important or private to you as well.
Bree?
I'm sorry, I don't know how to raise my hand on this. I actually have a question. If you go ahead.
Okay, yeah, we'll do Mary first. You'll ask your question, and then I'll kick it to Bree.
Okay, thanks. So my question is, when it comes to if you're trying to keep someone from doing harm to another person, Would that be like a binding spell to keep them from causing harm, or would that be, can you just give me some more information on that, please?
Absolutely. No, it's a good question. I hear some of that occasionally. You just in terms of how do you deal with external things? I will reference, of course, the ethics of witchcraft, mostly just assess your values appropriately when you're making these decisions to influence other people. And you can look that up later. But to your question, kind of depends on the route that you want to take. You can potentially bind individuals from each other. You could bind one individual to where they're not influenced by another thing. You could bind I guess, the more active component of that, person. Let's just use person A and B, right? If person B is the one that's causing more of the negative effects in person A's life, then you might bind that person's, potential or probability, right? Not necessarily the individual themselves. I could also see it as a sever an interaction. An example of that from my life is I had a specific individual in my life that was close, that was putting things into my life that I didn't want in there and was rather difficult for me to deal with. And so I decided, instead of a bind of like binding the memories, right, I chose to sever. It's one of those things I realized after the fact that when I did the spell to sever the memories, instead of just bind them, right, so to keep them isolated or to bind that person from those recollections that I had, that I chose severing instead. And now I don't remember any of those things. Those were just removed entirely. Was it effective to deal with the emotional aspect of that? Yes. But now I don't have those memories they're not there. Didn't know that was going to happen, but this is some of those risks that we take as witches of like, what's this result going to be, right? The severing would be, it really is up to the character, I guess, of the witch themselves. Some witches are a lot more engaged, and they may choose severing because it's more active, it's more driving, right? Versus binding, that's going to be more of a neutral stance that you're taking. And so it's kind of, that's why I say it's about the character of the witch, of kind of what their personality is like, right? If you're more of the peacekeeper type, the one that doesn't necessarily want to get directly involved, then it may be important to separate things out, right? So they're more clearly understood, versus severing that I'm just going to break things down, right? Experiment with both of them, but you can sort of see where you might go in either direction for that.
Can you hear me? Cool. I forgot a lot about what I was gonna say. I just remember cord cutting being really popular on TikTok. Like that was the thing that people wanted to do. And I don't know, that's interesting to me. That's it.
Yeah, cord cuttings are really popular. I think that it is high visibility, and I think it is in the, de rigueur of the day kind of stuff. Witchcraft goes through these fluctuations of things that are more popular or less popular as time goes on. It's just this amorphous sort of thing that happens, just like shadow work is really popular, but in like the 70s and 80s, that like didn't, as far as I hear from those witches back then, didn't have a lot of that shadow work. A lot of that was conjuration. A lot of that was entity work, spirit work. It was those sorts of things with ceremonial magic, versus what we have now when we're seeing more of this internal drive, but it kind of goes with our society. So that cord cutting, that higher visibility, we see these kinds of shifts. Like we're starting to see shifts into more baneful sides of magic instead of just the benefic. So the so-called harmful hexes, that sort of thing. We're seeing more of that now because there was such a swing the opposite way of so much of this love and light. And there's a value to both of these things, but it does seem to fluctuate.
Marisha?
Hi. The little thing I wanted to add to Mary's question, I think that there's also an aspect of partially like what you want to do, what your background is, your practice is. But I think that one thing that is not often thought about is binding people to themselves, like truly pulling the craft. I've done that before, and it was with a woman that just negatively affected multiple people. And when she stopped getting reactions, is when it really hit her. Like that was a big, big thing of just binding her to herself was an easy solution because that essentially mirrors everything she's putting out is just going straight back to her because she's in the binding. Another thing is with my practice, I do pocket crystals, or as I call them, bra crystals, all the time. Like recently I had a job interview, shoved some crystals in there, and it was for a coffee shop. So I dipped them in coffee, shoved them in my pocket. And not a lot of people think about bindings as being something that's temporary. A lot of bindings are seen as like, this is the binding, this is forever, but it doesn't have to be that big. It can be something super small like a crystal. Yeah, that's all I had.
I super love that so much. Like that's such a great idea.
Oh yeah, no, the coffee dip, and I smelled like coffee, so it was really good. Free perfume.
That also reminds me, Marisha, those really great points to bring up, that echoing that binding being non-permanent or not necessarily a huge long thing. Hand fastings, for example, were about tying two people together, and there's other hand fastings that occur, retie to rebind, right? But if the two people grew apart, it was an untying of those things, and then you would be retied to somebody else. And it wasn't this huge major thing of like, we have to file this paperwork and all this thing. It was just a symbol of those people, and they would continue to honor that hand fast, that time that they had, and they may retie as the years go by. But it was also that understanding that there was some temporariness to it, or potential option for it to be temporary. And so it was more of that signifier. And so similar to that binding, more of that fluctuation.
Colleen.
Okay, so I have a question about, I guess I'm curious, like if there's any particular tarot cards or yeah, I mean, because I do most of my working with tarot, so I'm curious if there's any particular tarot cards that you would strongly associate with binding and or severing, or one that really is like very much both, whether that's like in reverse or however you conceptualize that.
I have found myself working more with the Devil of the Major Arcana as a side note, mostly because it's related to barriers and boundaries and limitations, right? And so that would be more akin to, I guess, the bindings than anything else. But it's also the self-binding, the assertion of things that I'm doing in my life that I want to be more concrete. If I'm doing severing things, I would look probably more towards more active elements such as Mars or Volcanus or things of that nature, things that are driving or striking or piercing. And that would be related to things within the tarot cards themselves, right? So I'm looking for things that are in the fire element that would echo those kinds of aspects, planetary wise speaking. Anything that is really I just pulled this, it was the Knight of Swords, if I recall correctly, but that was also being very much driven, driving forward, breaking through things. You might even consider the Chariot in that, because there's a lot of that drive, this kind of untamedness to it. The Tower potentially as well, just in terms of its cataclysmic nature, not even necessarily negative, just very robust in its breaking down things very suddenly.
Monty had also suggested in the chat that death would be a good severing card. That's a good, ending and restarting of anything, And then Marisha also offered that she had some other information for that as well. Did you have like a link towards something, or did you just want to say more information, Marisha?
I just wanted to say more information. I didn't want to type it because I'm lazy. Essentially what I do is I have like a specific deck for doing my workings. It requested to be a working deck only, so for rituals basically only. I will do any twos of things. Like if I'm having like financial issues, I will do the two of coins. I will put it on my altar face up, and then once that bond breaks, I will put it I would put it upright. And that's how I do, because most severing is duality. It is the two things. And I am a huge tarot as well. So I love the inverting versus the upright. And that really seems to like big boom on all my stuff.
I really like that. That's super interesting. And I love the idea of using the devil and the chariot and tower. I have a kind of an ongoing working kind of with inner work where I'm using the Eight of Swords. But that is specifically for a part of myself that I'm not trying to like permanently bind. It's more of just getting in them that part into a space where it can, I can work with it in a more effective manner. But I really strongly associate that card with like not really being bound, but kind of being bound. So yeah, it's good to hear other perspectives because I'd like to, expand how I work with that concept.
Very cool. All right, Lou?
Here we go. Hi, everybody. I just wrote down some things that I work with, and I've used the athame to cut a person from my thoughts who is toxic to me. This is a person that, had the same type of experience as a lot of people here, which is they're so negative that they have this influx of negative energy. And so I try to withdraw from that person, but with family and friends, sometimes you just can't avoid them. So for me, I've used the athame for me to cut thoughts of them out of my life. That way they don't have, I'm not really affecting them. It's just for my mental health, and that's worked for me. The next thing that I did that really severs some of my bad habits. I'll write some of those things down and do the ceremony where you write everything down and then burn them. And then what I'll do is list new patterns, and I'm a musician, so I'll sing those new habits out, and the resonance of it and the frequency of the things that I want to do are just sort of cemented into my body and into my heart by singing. And let's see what else. That's it, basically. I just wanted to share my knowledge.
The perfect space for that here, right? And also at any of the meetings, it's how we learn as witches, right? And that's what we want to build in community, is that kind of sharing space. Really interesting seeing that into being. I think Monty might resonate really strongly with that pun, 100% intended. I also was, when you were talking about just self-severing, right? I was also thinking of times that alter, right? That being cloistered, being isolated. I've watched some videos on that in the past of people just isolating themselves, like monks sequestering themselves. Relating to tarot, we can call the hermit, right? We're binding ourselves to that specific thing. I like to use that in terms of when I'm in that kind of cloistering aspect, in that kind of limiting space. It's a sort of a protection aspect, I suppose. So I can focus on that one thing so the other stuff isn't bothering me or isn't influencing me. And so I often will find space and times that I can do that, so I can be a little more separated from everything else that's going on, have some insulation from that. I hadn't considered that before, so thank you, Lou.
You're welcome. Hey, and I wanted to also add my tarot card. I use the High Priestess, because if I'm really affected by everything earthly, I need to withdraw and go to the spiritual place. and that helps me to withdraw from that as well in my tarot.
Anyone else want to share anything before we start kind of closing down our time here?
Montague.
Yeah, I did want to share one more thing. It's a severing spell. I'm needing closure with a particular relationship with a with a family member, and I'm not going to get that closure, because we're estranged. And the idea that I had for it, I had this months ago, and this sermon is prompting me to actually do this, is writing a letter and then putting that paper in the compost bin. So that way it like severs very slowly over time. So when you were talking, Andrews, about severing things slowly over time, that's what I was thinking about there.
I like that idea. I have a water affinity. I'm not going to get too deep into that. Also pun intended. But also taking things like paper and then immersing that in water and then letting it dissolve over time is another one. So similar to the compost thing, I actually have not done that myself, but that is a place that I would go to for some of that kind of slow severing. And it might want to be more that gentle adoption of that disillusion of two things, right? So instead of me actively doing something with like fire or breaking something or whatever, it may be more efficacious to let it happen over time so that it takes its time to move through those processes, to process for yourself and all the things that are attached to that during that sequence too.
Mary.
Are there any other associations that would go well with binding rituals? And I guess like lunar times that would be good for it as well.
I have pieces of that information, but I'm wondering if Gwen or Ember wants to chime in on that one.
Yeah, so some of it kind of depends on how you work with the cycles of the moon. There's a couple of different ideas on when you should do things. The idea that you have your new moon or dark moon, some people equate them the same way, some people see them a slight bit differently. And you have it moving to waxing, then full moon, then waning, and back to that dark moon, new moon time frame. When you're doing something like a binding, if you're trying to do it to attract something, a lot of people will say you should do it during the waxing moon as it's gaining power, so to speak. And if you're doing a binding or a severing, obviously is getting rid of something, then you would do it towards that waning moon as it's slowly moving away from the full moon. If you are looking for an extra boost, a lot of people use the full moon for that. So as opposed to gaining or removing or anything like that, if you're like, I just need some help with this, I want to make sure it happens, some people will do the full moon for it. Some people see the dark moon or the new moon as kind of starting out with things, setting intentions. So if you're doing a binding or severing to kind of start anew, kind of like I think it was Lou was saying, writing down everything. You're getting rid of stuff and then you're bringing new stuff in. That might be good for the dark moon or new moon.
And then to even add an extra boost onto that, like, is doing a specific like day of the week during that moon phase. Like if you're trying to like get rid of like relationship type things, like during a waning moon, you might do it on like a Friday or something like that, because Fridays are typically about relationships. I will say when I do get like that nitpicky into my spells, they are more potent for me. So I'd even like look into that. Like if you're trying to get more of something, waxing, since we are talking about, binding and severing, waning moons, specific days, of the week, specific times of the day too, of like doing it. Like to bring something new into your life, you usually do that on like, the sunrise. But if you're trying to do like an ending of a thing, you're gonna do that at sunset or even at midnight. So like keeping even that like very specific times of the day as well in with your spell crafting.
Those were great suggestions. Thank you so much for chiming in on that. And also, thank you everybody for making sure that they were participating and just being here for this. It's been fascinating in this format, and it's been a lot of fun for me. If you prepared something for severance or a material or an item or a tool, you can set that aside for later use. You can charge that during one of the SBOTs, one of the moons. If you instead prepared something that might have been a vessel of binding, things like I like to use wood for this. There's a natural affinity to it. I have interest in other mediums, but that's a much longer conversation. With the piece of wood, though, that I did use for that binding, I carved sigils into that and amplified it in that manner. I think it's upstairs, but I have yarn that I used, and I did a witch's ladder with that. It's just the traditional string finger games that they have with that. You can look that up, but using that witch's ladder and then trapping it and then using that to tie and seal off that piece of wood is one way. So if I'm preparing these things, I have different materials to use for the future. You can set aside these until an opportunity arises or that becomes necessary. You can write these things down and get some idea of when something arises, that now you'll have some ideas of what to do if you want to bind or sever something. You'll kind of know this by your experiences and how you observe things, and it will shape those aspects of whether it's going to be binding or severing. Having materials set aside and prepared that are cleansed, consecrated, and charged helps me so that I have them available, or else I just tend not to do it, or I just delay forever because then I have so many more steps to do. And then also there are a lot of potentials for binding and severing, whether that's an individual, an external thing, an idea, any principle. Start playing with some of those concepts, write those down. And the church, generally, we encourage people to have a field guide. Oh, hey, look, I have mine. I have one right here. And this is basically just writing down the date and year of the thought that I have and just writing them all down and capturing those things. And from this, they will make its way into my grimoire. Maybe, maybe not, but it's a good thing to capture these kinds of thoughts as they're happening so you can look back, just like you would with any journals as well. Materials for this, for any support stuff, you can find these in a lot of different places. Crystals are great. You walking into a forest, if you do a lot of hiking, you can get a lot of materials that way. Rocks are great. Use your imagination. Being a witch uses a lot of imagination. And then any of the ideas or conversations about theurgy and thaumaturgy, sympathetic and contagion magic, or other aspects like ethics and whether or not we want to be engaging in these things, or if we even should be, and how to kind of assess those. You can look at a whole bunch of our other sermons that are available on YouTube and watch those to your heart's content. You can also feel free to email us, and that's on our website at churchofwitchcraft.org. And so there's ways to get in contact with us if you want assistance with this, if you want to plan things out for a spell that you're doing, even if it's not binding or severing. We're available. The clergy are available to you for that reason, to help support whatever your efforts are to the best of our abilities. You can find all of our information for dates that are coming up for events on our website, Meetup, Facebook, as well as Discord. Discord will be the most consistent and the most active, and there's a lot of people there that are sharing ideas and those kinds of things too. And that's a good way to kind of connect your community in this kind of disjointed way that we're still able to be connected together too. Like Gwen was saying, we have the full moon coming up. I'm getting tired, so apologize, but yeah, full moon's coming up for that tonight for the sermon as well. We've got some other stuff going on in Lincoln for the later part of the month. Maban is coming up, so autumn is a very busy time in general. Conserve your energy, pace yourself. There's a lot of stuff going on. Don't burn yourself out, please. But if you do, we'll work through it. And we have a lot of people that have had experience in that realm too. So again, thank you to everybody who was here. feel free to reach out to us or connect to us if you need anything else in the future. And perhaps we'll see you next month for the next sermon or at one of our events.